Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pamela Cohn, and it's my privilege and honor to host this podcast series. Today, we have with us Debra Sobel, the founder and the lead consultant at the Purpose Hub, and she's going to tell us all about the career path that got her there. Welcome, Debra.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So let's start there. Tell us a little bit about your career path and how you got to the point where you decided to start a company.
So I started my career, I was a BBC television producer director, and I worked on a lot of factual entertainment programs, Crime Watch, Watchdog, all sorts of programs I don't know if people have heard of or not. But I also worked on a lot of political and environmental documentaries. And the first big series I worked on was a 6-part series on climate change called Scare Stories. And that got me interested in everything around sustainability. So eventually, after 10 years, I left the BBC and founded my first, or co-founded my first creative agency. And over 19 odd years, I've run different creative agencies and strategic communications consultancies, all working with national and global organizations, really helping them communicate their purpose and helping them communicate it for impact and helping them navigate different communications challenges and ultimately to help them tell their stories with clarity in very risk-free ways, with complete authenticity and to build trust. And over the 20 years, I suppose I've narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. So now my focus at the Purpose Hub is really we help organizations to shape purpose and sustainability narrative and messaging. We work with leadership and help them facilitate alignment around their positioning. We help deliver clarity and consistency in their communications, which is really important, and help them deepen audience connection. And that comes with, when you have clarity of positioning and approach, confidence, creativity, and you know what you're saying is right-sized. So that means we're not overplaying any sort of purpose or sustainability claims. We're not under or downplaying anything, but we're putting everything across incredibly clearly, incredibly confidently, without any risk of reputational or regulatory fallout.
So just given everything that's happening in the world, mostly emanating from the US, I would suspect that some of your work has changed in the last 24 months, 48 months. Tell us how that has evolved and how the advice that you're providing clients has changed.
So it's really interesting, and the whole landscape, absolutely has undergone transformation over the past 18 months, 24 months. And I think, with Trump coming in January, and not to get at all political, but to state facts, there clearly has been an anti-ESG backlash. ESG, in itself, the term has become quite weaponized and politicized. But we've also seen increasing and evolving reporting regulations. We've seen stricter rules come from bodies like the CMA and ASA and the EU Green Claims Directive. And so what we've seen is companies nervous, wanting to comply, obviously, with constantly changing regulatory environments. Feeling anxious about, and particularly if they have a presence in the States, but actually it's sort of spread itself across anyway, even if they don't have presence in the States. How do we talk about purposeful commitments and strategy? How do we talk about, commitments to our people, to the communities in which we operate, and to the environment, all underpinned by good governance? How do we talk about that confidently when actually putting our heads above the parapet, we might risk political fallout, reputational fallout? How do we steer a clear path forward in such an environment? And that's really been what we've been tackling with clients. Nervousness around greenwashing, and therefore that leads to maybe green hushing. So therefore you're not talking about anything at all, which you say too little, and that kind of doesn't engender trust or authenticity either. So it's about, how do companies now navigate this landscape effectively? How do they deliver clarity? How do they mitigate against any reputational risk? And really, a lot of the work we do is, how do we ensure communications remains very credible, very relevant for stakeholders, very regulation ready? And how do we communicate in a way that absolutely still steers the organization forward and mobilizes behavior change and drives impact, positive impact? Because aside from all the changes that have happened, what we can't ignore is that there are still issues around social mobility. There are issues around financial inclusion. We can't just ignore mental health and wellness of our people. We do have to look at the communities in which we're operating in, and there is a climate crisis. So whatever's happening geopolitically, companies do need to take a stance, not have this sort of ESG whiplash that we talk about all the time. Shall we do this? Shall we do that? What's happening here? Shall we change to this? How do you steer a very clear, confident path forward?
So you touched on I think what my next question is going to focus on, which is, you spoke about how communicating about these behaviors and commitments and so forth is changing. Is the actual behavior and commitment changing?
I would say there's been a recalibration. So it's not necessarily that companies are less committed. I think many companies have dialed back. If you look at certain websites, many companies have removed policies from their websites. They've removed sustainability reports from their websites. If we look at Pride Month in June this year, very interesting to see lots of companies a lot quieter. I'm actually not so crazy about companies changing logos, and it's a little bit performative to me anyway. But it was just interesting as a snapshot to see how many companies I know were still producing campaigns or holding really meaningful initiatives for Pride Month, but weren't talking about it on LinkedIn, for example, which they might have previously done. So I definitely think there's been a recalibration. Yeah, I also think there's been a dialing back of language. So although companies are still moving forward with commitments, for example, that instead of talking about hard goals, they're now talking about sort of softer aspirations. And I think that's sort of indicative of where we're at really in the climate that we're in.
So amongst your clients, what has been the biggest challenge in the last 12 to 18 months?
I think that the biggest challenge, it's a big challenge, but I'm going to put it on one side, the keeping up with regulatory requirements. It's huge. It's huge and become an enormous job for heads of sustainability. How do you comply? How do you make sure your reporting falls in line, and all the data and pulling in all the data that surrounds all of that? I think for me, and again, we're coming from a communications point of view, it's how do you create confident internal alignment? How do you ensure the language that you're using will resonate? It is consistent, but will also resonate. We work with a lot of global organizations. How can you make sure that it will land with multiple different stakeholders culturally, across markets, and how do you really integrate being a responsible business into the heart and the DNA of your organization? Because I think the companies that have fared best over the last couple of years are the ones where sustainability isn't a bolt-on, but where it's fully integrated. It's not a standalone strategy, but it's embedded into business as usual. So it's integrated into core strategy, into legal and procurement and operations and communications. And I think that shows real maturity. And that allows companies to then confidently say, well, we're still addressing, despite what's happening in the States or despite the backlash, we're still charting our way forward, when it comes to our commitments on belonging. They don't even want to call it DEI anymore, but that's fine.
Right.
We're moving forward because we still need to be inclusive and we still need to look after our people and etc.
So when companies have to dial back or have made the decision to dial back the language or to take some language from their websites, et cetera, and you spoke earlier about internal alignment, how do you communicate that with your employees when for years you've been touting your commitment to all of these different things and then suddenly, carefully, deliberately pull back at least the talking about it? How do you get internal alignment on that and still true to your core values that you've been touting for years?
So I think there's an enormous amount to unpack in what you've been saying. I think it depends on what you have already committed to and what you've already been communicating and how you've been communicating, and have you been communicating that historically in the right way? That's a whole thing that would need unpacking first, and then a look at leadership and trust in leadership and authenticity of leadership, and have you proven that you have made progress on certain commitments? All that really needs unpacking to ensure any communications moving forward is really authentic, that there's integrity in it. I would just say honesty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I really believe that communications around this needs to come from a leadership that whatever they say feels genuine and feels authentic, that you're not hiding anything, that you're not masking anything, that there is utter honesty. If you have had to dial back, if you've made a decision to remove X, Y, and Z policy, you need to explain why. And there needs to be really solid justification. And so I suppose I will dial back a few stages and say, this is where internal alignment is critical. And this is where cross-departmental collaboration is critical. Because what we often see is there's a disconnect. So strategy doesn't talk to communications, doesn't talk to marketing, doesn't talk to legal, doesn't talk to HR, doesn't bring in risk. And that's where there are many, many pitfalls in how you're putting messaging across. Because if you are communicating around a change in policy or a change in strategy, or you want to show that you are navigating a very challenging time and this is how and this is what it means, there absolutely has to be complete alignment and very clear, consistent messaging. And that needs people across different departments to come together. You cannot move forward unless everybody is in the room around that table discussing the approach, basically.
That's exactly right. And I also feel like when that doesn't happen, that is when the risk for all sorts of litigation gets higher, right? Because the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, or the right hand is saying one thing and the left hand is doing something else. So
absolutely.
when it comes to litigation, particularly, I suppose, with your area of expertise on the communication side, talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing and what your clients are worried about when it comes to risk of communicating.
So they are worried about backlash internally. They're worried about employees and what employees will say. There are always questions about, will we come across authentically? Will we able to gain, how can we gain the trust of our employees? How can we communicate in a way which will inspire, will attract new talent, will retain that new talent, will help us drive genuine change? That's one thing. Then there is, and how do we communicate externally? How do we make sure we rank well? Are we communicating all the things we need to be communicating in order to rank well? And how do we communicate in order to avoid any accusations of greenwashing or any accusations? What the questions that we get are more like, we're not a perfect business. That comes up so often. Well, let me let you into a little secret. No business is a perfect business, and no business is getting everything 100% right. So that's okay. But then when it comes to the communications around it, we have to look at a narrative that becomes risk-free, or we have to really analyze any of the risks and be able to be very open. And we don't want to, as I said at the top, we don't want to overplay any environmental or social commitments, and we don't want to underplay either. So it's really finding the right balance, and that just means we have to have very accurate, very substantiated claims if we're making any. We have to make sure that the claims are, or any communications is very specific, can be substantiated, that we're showing evidence, and also that we're telling stories in a very human, real, honest way. And I think if a company is concerned, so let's take however many years ago HSBC with the greenwashing, sort of misleading climate ad claims. Climate change doesn't do borders. So why they were kind of hauled across the coals was because they were talking about environmental initiatives and all the good things that they were doing. But what they failed to mention was, considerable contribution to the climate crisis and money going into new oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important in what we're communicating, in how we're communicating, in the visuals that we're using in any content that we put out, that we are looking at it from a communications point of view, from a marketing point of view, from a risk point of view, from a legal point of view, from a strategy point of view. And that's where everyone comes together to look at, is this the right approach? This is a fair and honest and transparent approach. And are we trying to tuck things or hide things into a corner somewhere that is obviously going to be pulled out by, press, PR, ASA, whatever.
And so are you seeing a tendency towards green hushing for fear of being accused of greenwashing?
Yes. And when companies go quiet, silence also speaks volumes.
Yes.
So actually, it is really, really critical that companies do address this. And if there is any anxiety or nervousness around how you get this right, the risk isn't in communicating purpose, it's in not communicating purpose correctly. Right. And so it is just about having those conversations internally with the right people at the right levels to talk about, genuinely for our organization, what is it? What's the positive change that we are trying to drive? Forget the outside world, forget any other context, forget regulation for the moment. What is it that as a business or as an organization, is genuinely meaningful to us? Where is the genuine change that we can affect or positively impact? And then it's building out around that. Where are the areas we need to change, and being transparent about what we need to change and communicating around what we need to change and how we're going to change it and by when we're going to change it and what that looks like and what that means for our people and what that will mean for our clients or customers, etc. And it's just working through all those different areas. So actually then when you put out communications, it's consistent and aligned internally and externally. But B, you feel very confident in what you're saying because you can back it all up.
So I have a couple of questions left. My next one has to do with, what do you think we're going to see in the next 12 to 24 months? What's on the horizon?
Well, I think there's definitely going to be tightened regulations and mandatory disclosures. That's for sure. I think there could still be increased litigation and activism around ESG claims, biodiversity impacts, social performance, that sort of thing. I think there will remain scrutiny and increased eyes. Interesting, we've just completed a couple of sustainability reports for businesses who have specifically said this time round, we know there's all eyes are going to be on, how we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or how we're talking about, environmental commitment. So companies are very aware that there are eyes, all over what they're doing at the moment. From a communications point of view, I hope that that companies do think about bringing communications as a seat to their table, because what I have seen is it's communications often works in silo. And I think there just needs to be more collaboration and more conversation and bringing them in. So that I would like to see over the next year, 18 months. And it's interesting to see the impact AI will bring in terms of ESG strategy, operations, reporting, ethics. That for me is a really interesting one to watch.
So my favorite question I always save to last. So given this very challenging and rapidly changing environment that we're practicing in, that we're working in, that we're living in, what gives you hope?
I like that question. What gives me hope and why I continue to work in this field is because the people that are driving forward these agendas are genuinely passionate, brilliant, motivated people, completely aware of the various crises or situations that we need to tackle. And they are people that can see the long term and think in the long term as opposed to short term issues, right, or gains or challenges. So it gives me hope that there are absolutely brilliantly passionate people out there that are still sticking with it and, you know, charting a course forward. And all the work that I see going on, you know, despite everything, I mean, business is critical in making change and in creating really positive change for people and planet. And there's just absolutely amazing work that's being done. And that gives me hope. And when I get to help companies communicate that and produce content around that and inspire people around that and mobilize genuine behavior change, that's fantastic.
Yes, that's got to be inspiring.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much for your insights and for your time with us today. I'm sure our listeners will enjoy listening and hearing more about your work. And they can reach you by website, thepurposehub.com.
Yes, and they can also on LinkedIn. They connect with me on LinkedIn and my email, Debra@thepurposehub.com. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It's been our pleasure. Take care.